Hello again.
Hey.
Nice to see you. Um, I mean, it's interesting, I guess, to talk about photography with you, Olivier, and we've never really actually had the chance to do something like this before, so it's nice to do it. I guess for people listening, and the people here, you've already heard Olivier commissioned this work. It was about a year ago now, I think, which is incredible. I think, what were the dates? Around, yeah, about a year ago exactly, which kind of goes to show how quickly time is flying.
Indeed, yeah.
And I mean, I can talk about this work, but I also want to kind of be nice to hear your perspective on where photography sits, not just in New Zealand and not just in relation to this project, but kind of what documentary photography and photojournalism, what's happening with it from your perspective. Because you have a big connection, so yeah.
Maybe I can start with giving a sense of how we started this project and how I discovered your work in the first place.
Yeah.
That was like just in the aftermath of the mosque shooting in New Zealand a couple of years ago, and I had seen one of your photo on the it's a Getty website. You were freelancing for Getty Images, and you were like, there was this one gathering in Auckland that was there was like hundreds, thousands of people. That was in March 2019. And of all the photos I had seen of this gathering, your photos stood out. There was a quality to it, like the colors, the framing, like there was really this sense of beauty coming out of your photos that I other photographers that were covering that event. And so when I saw these photos and I used them in the Washington Post that month, I wrote down your name. I was like, okay, I need to find out who this guy is and see if there's an opportunity to work with him at some point. That opportunity came a year later for another like crazy story in a sense. And what was very interesting from the start about New Zealand and the coronavirus crisis was how the country, compared to a lot of other countries around the world, had its act together. And I'm sure that being an island helps a lot. It's much easier to shut down borders and international travel when you're an island. But it was really this fascination from us, from readers, from the rest of the world about what was going well in New Zealand, but also like it felt when we looked at New Zealand and when we looked at and what was happening with the shutdown. It was one of the first countries to issue a complete shutdown. And the reopening later on, it always felt that like when you were looking at New Zealand, you were looking at the future of other countries, and so that's what like I wanted to work with you on this, like and get the sense of what was going well and how developing in New Zealand. And that's when like we started talking and commissioned this project. And maybe we can look at some of the photos and you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, I mean, I guess this project was unusual for me as a photographer because a lot of my work is about I keep freezing and it's making me feel weird on the screen. About forming connections with people, interacting with people intimately, and that just wasn't possible with this work. The pictures aren't moving. Yeah, so throughout working on this series over, I guess it was a few months I shot this. I felt a real, a sense of isolation and a sense of disconnect, and also, a great kind of sadness seeing what was happening out there. Although New Zealand was in control compared to a lot of other places, it was still and still is now, in a lot of trouble, and a lot of people lost their businesses. Mental health issues skyrocketed. So yeah, it was a bit of a conflict for me. I was very excited to work with you, and to have the opportunity to make pictures for such a large audience. But you feel guilty a little bit, I guess, at times.
Yeah, I think that's like it's interesting that you say that, because this is something I've heard from a lot of photographers when they were photographing this crisis. It's the fact that like they felt guilty, like they're like, not only you're in a situation where you're still allowed to go out because you're an essential worker in a sense, and you're kind of profiting. Like there's always this idea in photojournalism of like, are you profiting from the situation? And the thing is that always to remember is the fact that like you're recording history. How often have we seen the streets of the world completely empty? These photos are a memento of
Exactly.
this insane period of time. And so that's what I look at when I look at your work, like this, like really the record of New Zealand under lockdown and under this crisis.
Yeah, I think that's speaks a lot towards this work, but also is kind of my philosophy for why I make pictures, because things find new meanings over time, right?
Exactly.
The mundane becomes something completely different through political, social, fashion trends. It's all, it's very interesting how things develop. That's the Olympic gym in Newmarket. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you start photographing the series before Olivier got in touch with you?
No. Well, no. I think before Olivier commissioned the work, I was photographing my family in our homes, like probably every other photographer in the world. This opportunity, well, the pandemic gave people the opportunity to connect really intimately with their family in ways that they might not have, due to time. I think I've seen a lot of photographers kind of pointing the lens back at themselves and their families. Would you agree with that, Olivia? Would you?
Completely. Like this was like really the it really created a movement among photographers. Like you had like the photographers that had no choice but continued to work in the streets and like be out there. Like I'm talking a lot about like wire photographers, for example, or newspaper photographers. But a lot of like documentary photographers who are more project-based photographers found themselves like like under lockdown in that way, and some also was like because it was a scary world out there. Like there was this invisible virus that like at the first few weeks we didn't really know how it transmitted itself. Like like there was a moment where everyone was freaking out about surfaces, and then it was like having a mask and all this. So it really created a sort of movement of photographers turning their camera towards their own families and their own situations. And I think this is something that's going to be fascinating to look at years down the line, this sort of like of internal, you know, more intimate work that was produced. And I'm sure that a lot of photographers learned a lot from that as well. And it's going to influence their own practice in the future.
Yeah.
And did you do that as well, Cameron? In parallel to this, did you photograph your family and home situation?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It was, you know, I made a huge archive of photos in my home throughout this period. Yeah, it was a great opportunity to do that, but I mean, I do that all the time anyway, right? I photograph my kids constantly.
That's good.
Yeah, I live really close to the airport as well. I live probably.
I love that photo.
Yeah, I live 10 minutes drive or less from the airport, so I was going out there quite often, and man, it was spooky. Like it felt really, I felt really uncomfortable being there.
And that's the thing that, like, you know, like this kind of scenes we only saw in, you know, in end of the world movies. And so like for a lot of people, like, and for me as well, like just walking down the streets of DC was this sort of sense of I've never lived through this. And when you look at the photos of you know, your photos and all the photos that were taken of these empty streets, that's what eerie. And that's what, like, one of the things that attracted a lot of the readers as well to these photos. Like that's, I love that cart. Like, even though I know that it's like of the photo of like a supermarket that transformed overnight into a sort of like, you know, delivery. Just that photo is just like fascinating to me. That and that cart, like in the middle of this empty warehouse.
And Olivier, can you talk a little bit about how you first came across Cameron's work?
So that's like, yeah, that was really when I saw his work on the mosque shooting. But it was something about one of the reasons why I wanted to work with Cameron is because I felt that he had an eye for, like, that he looked at the events and at things differently. And by that I mean, like, in a way that he frames his photos. Like I feel like his approach reminds me of like some of the best street photographers out there, where a street photographer is not just like someone that just like walks down the street and just take random photos. It's someone that like analyze the movement, analyze everything that's going and in the frame, and like, and even like anticipating what's going to happen in the frame. And so when I was looking at Cameron's photos of that event in Auckland after the mosque shooting, I could feel that. I could feel that, like, once he got to that place, he looked around and he really analyzed the situation and analyzed what was going to be the best photos. And even, you know, like a lot of photographers do that, but they do that in more of a, okay, this is going to be the money shot. And I felt that, like, there with Cameron was, he is going to compose like a painting almost. And so that's what I was like looking for. Like, you know, there's other photographers in New Zealand, like, and I, like, you know, I haven't worked with a lot. But me choosing Cameron was really like this, like, I'm going to get something that's different and it's more constructed visually, in a sense. And even that photo, I just love it. You know, like, you know, another photographer might have just like made sure that it was going to be this sort of very pristine photo. And I find that one so much more powerful because it says there's a lot of symbolism in it. It talks about our time. It talks about the confusion that we're all feeling. It's like it also has the leader of this country that like seemed to get things right when others were not. You have a little bit of the flag behind. So there's so many elements there that just like says a lot. And that's what I was looking for when I was looking to work with Cam.
Thank you for saying that. That was, you said very kind things that makes me feel very good. Oh yeah, it's very nice to hear that.
Do you know what the your audience response was to the images when they were in the Washington Post?
So we were at a time where there was a complete fascination from our readers for anything New Zealand. Anytime we wrote about New Zealand, it was like, you know, some of the most read stories of the day. And I think it, because at that time, there was a sense around the world that New Zealand was the model to follow. So, you know, like, to be truthful, I knew right away that like, no matter what I did around New Zealand in terms of like photography, it would get the kind of response that like positive response we wanted. But you know, going back to what I was saying about like what set Cameron apart from other photographers that we hired in other country was that like, you know, looking for that painterly almost depiction of what was going on, looking for that like slight odd angle that just like transformed the photo. So like and pose on that photo. I just love that photo. For me, that was like one of the of my favorite photos the whole series. Like, you know, like you have this woman who is clearly in the process of putting her mask up, and like the mask right now is over her eyes, and you know she's in the process of putting it down. But that represented so much of what we were feeling around the world, this sort of blindness, because like everything we were reading at that time back in April, May, and June of 2020 was like, okay, is it this or is it that? Like, what's going on? Like, is there going to be a vaccine? Is like, should we like lock down more? Like, what should we do? And so there was this sense of complete confusion. And I felt that photo was like saying so much when you had the stores in the background that are completely closed. You have these empty streets where it's just her. And then you just have her movement, like you like the way that she's walking down. And like, you know, first reaction might be like, oh, this is like not flattering, but I find it so like iconic in the sense of like it is all of us. She is representing everything that we're feeling right now, this sort of like complete like confusion, this worldwide confusion. And I just love that photo. When I saw that, I was like, this is exactly why I wanted to work with Cameron.
Thank you.
How much time with the lockdown did you spend out on the streets shooting?
I would shoot every day for probably 3 or 4 hours, and I'll always walk on foot. So I would drive into the city and then I'd walk probably 15, 20 kilometers all over and shoot constantly, and did that for weeks or months, I guess. Yeah, I mean, it was strangely nice to be out in a place that was so quiet, you know? Kind of nice in a weird way. But I think, yeah, for me, the work, it was really important to show people alone, you know, and throughout, I mean, in this folder, I'm showing there's outtakes as well. But I really wanted to kind of show that the individual space, you know, the people alone. Because I think a lot of people felt very alone throughout all this stuff.
Someone's asked online, was this a designed project or simply responding to the times?
Was it a design? What was the question again? Was it a design project or?
Responding to the time.
No, so this is responding to the times. I mean, to respond. You could never design anything like this, I don't think. And you probably wouldn't want to either, right?
I think there's a little bit of both in the sense that, like, you know, like the first impulse is like it's really responding to the times. It's like, you know, you find yourself in a situation that like even during the Spanish flu, there wasn't this sort of a world shutting down. This was really the first time, and like you had to respond to that. You had to like visually tell the story of that time, because again, like this is history. This is like an historical moment. And then I think for a lot of photographers, and I'm sure for Cameron as well, like then it becomes a project. Then it becomes something where you're continuing, like you're building on it, and you're trying to find the selection of photos, the best selection of photos that tells the full story. And, you know, like you're not getting the full story in the first day and second day. It takes weeks to get the full story, and especially in a situation like this one, it kept on changing. It kept on evolving. You know, like we would get out of the lockdown, and then the second lockdown would come in, and then the lockdown would be lifted partially, and it was like ever evolving. And so as a result, I think for a lot of photographers, like what they started as responding to the time then became something more constructed and more thoughtful in that sense. Like I love that photo as well of the ropes here. So it's like the closed like shop that's about to reopen. Like you have the ropes, you have this sort of like a sense of, you know, of VIP treatment. And then, you know, on the floor, they just say where you have to stand. And I just love that. And again, like coming back to one of the reasons why I wanted to work with Cameron is like, you look at the way that he framed his photo. He could have seen that scene and decided, okay, I'm going down and next to her and I'm just going to photograph that way. But I think like the way that he framed it had a sense, like a different approach that made it more powerful. There was this sense of even in a way that like in a place where he is, of remote place, of like of disconnection, because we were all disconnected in from each other. It's like standing away from that person.
Olivier, were you ever tempted to commission a follow-up to this story when New Zealand was out of lockdown and the rest of the world was pretty much still confined to their homes?
So some of the images that you're seeing are of like when the lockdown is being lifted, where like there's a start of lifting the restriction, where people are coming back to stores, and so that was like part of the work that we published was of that lockdown. And there's I'm seeing an audience question on the face mask. I think that's actually a very interesting question. I love that photo as well, with all the markings on the street. Sorry, I'm jumping from one thing to another. So it's a question about face mask and so the question is, says face masks were not recommended or enforced early in the year. How far into the pandemic was the image of masked people taken? And I find that's like, this is what was fascinating at the beginning was that a lot of photos coming in of people wearing face mask. They, you know, like you had like when you were looking at the situation in New York or in DC, you had to have half the people wearing face mask and the other half where they weren't. And it was at the moment where there was really this, especially in the US, this sense that like China being really like accused of being responsible for this, and there was racism that like was coming out of that as a result, especially in the US. And so we were very careful in the way that we published photos of people in face masks. There was a lot of Asians that were wearing face masks in the US, but that's also because of cultural reason. This is like a culture that is a lot more accustomed to wearing a face mask in public spaces. So we had to be careful in how we were, like how we were publishing photos, like making sure that we weren't, in a sense, creating this sentiment that only Asians were that Asians were responsible for this virus. So we had to be very careful in the images that we were selecting. There was a lot of you'd see a lot of photos on the wires where the only people photographed with face masks were Asian people. And so you were, by only doing this, you were creating a sentiment that like sick people with masks are only Asian. And it's only like a few months into the crisis where like the CDC, for example, in the US decided like to recommend face masks finally, even though like a lot of people were saying from the start, like you need the face mask, that the photos of masked people became a lot more commonplace, where like it was really like 75 to 80% of all photos that we were seeing every day were with people being masked. Then later on, it was kind of like we had to be careful when we were publishing photos of people wearing face masks that they were wearing the mask properly. So you always had this sort of like discussion like, oh, well, this is a great photo, but the guy mask is under his nose. Do we reflect what's happening in the sense of like show that photo, or do we have a public service role to play where we have to show like people that are wearing the mask correctly? So there was a lot of discussion around face mask photos. It was a fascinating moment.
And Cameron, when did you start kind of noticing the face masks happening here? How late in the pandemic?
I feel like people were quite quick to respond and accept the use of masks here. Yeah, I think so.
I think it goes back to the fact that like at least from the outside, it really felt like New Zealand had its shit together. That they really understood the science earlier than other countries.
Sorry, specifically the portraits that you had on earlier with Green Street, probably the face masks. When were they taken?
They would have been taken in the first level 4 lockdown.
What, during April?
Yeah.
Is that the masks were recommended here quite some time?
Right. Well, I guess there's a lot of contradictions, right? Throughout the whole process. Yeah. I found like this I mean, painting little stencils on the ground, telling people to stay away from each other. It's kind of like, I guess it works. I don't know, maybe. It's kind of funny.
I think that it was a sort of typography of the pandemic that emerged. This sort of signs that you would see like on the ground painted, and the signs that you see on the doors. This sort of like new visual vocabulary that was created from this crisis that I find fascinating. And even like this. Sorry.
Did you commission work from similar to this work as well?
Sorry, you were breaking up. I couldn't hear the question.
Did you commission similar work to this, but from other countries to see the situation that was happening in other places?
Yeah, we like, like not just me, a lot of like photo editors at the Washington Post were commissioning similar work with, across the US, especially in the where, like some states, like some cities were more more closed than others because they believed in the virus more. Like the politics comes into play in the US, like in every other debate and issues. But like myself around the world as well, like, we commission in Japan, we commission in South Korea, we even commission in the Middle East, in Paris, and like every country was different in a way. Like you had like countries where everything was a lot more, like the situation was not a runaway kind of situation, health situation. And then you had others that like were completely shut down because they had to, like you couldn't see one person in the streets. So there was like this, there's like readers were fascinated by these photos. I was fascinated as a photo editor by these photos. And so wanted to see how different countries reacted. Yeah.
Did you feel like the only photos you were seeing were COVID related?
Last year felt like where we were only, I'd say the first 3 months were just COVID, and all we were commissioning, all we were publishing was just COVID. And then the years just got crazier. Like especially in the US, we had like the racial tension. Then in Beirut, we had the massive explosion. I had to deal with that as well. Plus the American elections just added like even more crazy on top of everything. So it started where everything was just COVID, and then it was COVID and something else, like you were covering like a racial protest in a COVID world. You were covering an election in a COVID world.
That's fascinating. Quite scary.
Yeah.
Man, you must be tired, huh?
Oh, it's exhausting. It's really exhausting. Like it ended up where like my weekends, when I had weekends, was just like shutting down everything and just watching something that turns your brain off and takes you away from that craziness.
I don't think I have any more pictures in this folder, so that's probably the final one.
There's a question on the chat, like, did the reader ever feel that they had enough representation of COVID? I would say that in the first few months, in the first 6 months, the readers couldn't get enough. There was, like, it goes back to the fact that we were living through an unprecedented event. And so, like not only everyone wanted to see more, but everyone wanted to share their own imagery as well. We did a lot of projects around like like you talked about, Cameron talked about how he was photographing his family. We did a lot of projects about that as well, like gathering to photography that like photographers were taking of their own families, because there was this sort of shared experience. I saw a lot of like even like imagery of Zoom meetings like that emerged from this as well. Like photographers looked at the world that was being like lived online as well. So I think it was a lot of like of desire and hunger for to see a lot of the representation of COVID. Then the second part of the year, that's like where there's like the fatigue that comes into play, and that's completely normal. People are a little bit fed up of just hearing and seeing about COVID, but I think it's a kind of event where we're going to look back at the photography years down the line, and we're going to see how important that photography was, and how we connect to it a lot more than with other events, because we all lived that.